There's a lot of different consultants out there. You could look at architecture firms, engineering firms, planners, master planners, or folks like me that we specialize in doing just the accessibility assessment. My colleagues and I, we call it an assessment or a survey. There's other folks in the field that they will call it an audit. It's just like tomato. Essentially, they should collect the same information. My colleagues and I, we don't like to use the term audit because if you've ever been audited, for your taxes, it kind of doesn't, it's not a really positive connotation there. And so we don't want people to think that, that an audit would reflect negatively on the public entity. That's why we're more inclined to call it an assessment or a survey. It's basically a snapshot in time, the conditions for the time that we went out and made the measurements to see if they were consistent with the ADA standards. So through our assessment process, the methodology that we use looks at the visitor approach. We go out, we identify the physical and communication barriers and to program services and activities. And your parks and recreation facilities, those are really the supporting facilities where those program services and activities take place. We follow the sequence used by the visitor. So we use the site arrival point, the exterior route to those places where the program services and activities are. And then we look at the needs of different user groups, like people with mobility impairments, visual impairments, hearing impairments, and cognitive impairments. As I've mentioned before, it's a snapshot in time. It's the data that was collected on that particular day that the assessment was done. We use the 2010 ADA standards for accessible design. So if you were looking at either your team doing it internally or having a consultant done, I would make sure that that's the first primary reference point that they're doing their comparison in. And then also any other proposed or state or local standards that you might have that are more stringent. Definitely the principles of universal design, and if there are other best practices that you would like to adopt. If you, and then we're going to look at making recommendations for that barrier removal. So this kind of gives you an idea of going out to a site. This is an outdoor interpretive nature center. And we've gone out and we've prioritized the different barriers. So one of the main programs that happens is at their outdoor amphitheater, where an interpretive specialist gives a talk to students about the environment there, the flora and fauna, the history. There's no access to that outdoor amphitheater. There's no accessible route. There's no accessible seating. It's an assembly area that has a PA system. There's no compatibility with any type of assistive listening system. So that is the whole purpose. Starting activity that happens for that interpretive center is everybody comes into that amphitheater to get a talk by the interpretive specialist. So we have identified that as a critical deficiency there for barrier removal. The second one there in the upper right-hand corner that goes into the interpretive center, the door is too heavy there. We've identified that barrier and the need to adjust the door pressure or install an automatic door opener. The third option in the lower left there, that is an outdoor drinking fountain. It has the wheelchair accessible unit, but there's no unit for standing for people that have difficulty bending or stooping over. And then the fourth there is the operating control on the toilet is outside of the reach range. So we've categorized all of those to give the entity a better idea of how the barrier affects participation in the program, service, or activity for people with disabilities. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the order that we're going to remove the barriers. We're just identifying how important that barrier removal is so that people with disabilities will be able to fully participate in the program. So, and we think that's really important for you as a public entity to know how that program access plays into the removal of the barriers. I don't want to go, a lot of times you'll hear from consultants out in the field to go, you know, once they've completed their transition plan, to go fix all the quote unquote low-hanging fruit, you know, which, you know, they mean to do the things that are easily done without much time or expense. Well, my response to that is the low-hanging fruit is not necessarily the best tasting fruit. Going out and doing all those little fixes, like changing doorknobs to lever handles, or changing, lowering paper towel holders when there is actually no wheelchair accessible stall in the restroom, that might not necessarily be the best use of our resources when there's no access to the whole reason that people come out to that venue, whether or not it be the trail or the outdoor amphitheater or the fishing area or the swimming pool. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to go fix 100 doorknobs in a recreation center when we don't have access through the restroom to the swimming pool and there's no lift in the swimming pool itself. So those are kind of some of the important decisions that you'll need to be making in the transition plan and how the barrier affects your program access. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the first thing that you do, but usually those critical deficiencies, those are the ones that involve the most planning. So I've kind of given you some examples here on the assessment survey, you know, what's included in the assessment or survey versus what's included in the transition plan. So both the assessment survey and the transition plan would include the physical and communication barriers to the program's goods or services and the solution for barrier removal. Then taking that to the next level, the transition plan is also going to include a timeline for the barrier removal. It's going to identify who the responsible person and unit is. Maybe it's something that you've decided you're not going to make it accessible. The ADA requires you to report what you're going to do in lieu of barrier removal. So say, for example, you have a park that has 5 trails and, you know, you've identified 4 out of those 5 trails are not accessible. You're not going to be doing any updates to those trails. Maybe a couple of them are social trails that you don't even mean for people to be going on. You could actually report in lieu of barrier removal. We would recommend that people use, you know, the Green Apple Trail is the primary trail that goes through the facility and tells the interpretive story of this park or forest or nature area. But you would definitely be reporting back on that. And then when you make corrective actions, we want to make sure that we're documenting our corrective actions. What were the steps taken to make that site accessible? You know, what were the costs? Those are the things that you should be reporting back to your executives, your elected board, so that they have a better understanding of what your ongoing barrier removal needs are and accomplishments are. So this next slide I've given you, this is kind of a sampling of, this is a county park system that had 22 major parks and facilities. We recorded about 1,000 different work orders to remove deficiencies for them. And they ended up being, their 20% or 19% of those 1,000 work orders were identified as critical barriers in order to achieve program access. Then about 42% of the 43% were priority 2s, 33% more moderate or priority 3s, and then priority 4s were those minor, about 5%. And some of the examples of those most frequently cited recommendations for barrier removals. Picnic areas continues to be one of the top areas that we need to look at making accessible. They had more than 107 locations where they needed to make improvements to include mobility features. Opening forces on doors, modifications to existing pathways, signage at restrooms, signing and striping accessible parking spaces, insulating exposed pipes at lavatories, lowering coat hooks or installing coat hooks within the reach range, adding or replacing existing drinking fountains with a high-low combination units, adjusting opening force on doors, and then providing accessible fire rings and grills. And just to kind of give you an idea, one of the things that we also do that I would recommend if you're working with a consultant that they be able to do for you is give you an idea of cost estimates so that you've gone through all of your facilities and you have an idea of what it's going to cost you for each one of these corrective actions. So you can see, you know, creating an accessible picnic unit or picnic shelter, we're looking at a capital improvement upwards of $25,000 per site. You know, so you know right off the bat, if you have 10 or 20 parks in your system, how many of those picnic shelters need to be made accessible and what that cost is going to be for you. You know, and I'm going to reiterate is that your elected board and your executives, they can't give you something if they don't know that you need it. So the transition plan works for you to make those funding requests. It is the data that you need to support the fact that you need more funding for accessibility improvements. So you can really work to use that to your advantage. Adjusting doors to installing automatic door openers, anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000. Modifying existing pathways, that could be an easy maintenance fix versus a capital improvement. Installing restroom signage, striping, parking spaces, you know, you can look at up to $1,200 for that. Is that something that you contract out? Is it something that you can do internally? Insulating pipes could be anywhere from $60 and upwards. Replacing those drinking fountains with high-low combination units, you know, the unit itself, if you need to, we have a lot of agencies that buy those in bulk. The transition plan gives you the data to know how many new ones that you might be able to purchase each year in bulk. And then where you have any type of restrooms that need to be made accessible, the transition plan would give you the data to identify where those are located, you know, and for each restroom to create an accessible stall in there, you're looking at upwards of $12,000 just to start with.